The air smelled like old rain and forgotten summers. She stood at the edge of the driveway, suitcase in hand, staring at the house she used to call home. Time had softened its edges, paint peeling, shutters faded, yet somehow it still stood as if waiting for her. Waiting with the kind of patience only memories could keep. She hadn't planned to come back. It wasn't for holidays or closure, or any of those neat reasons people like to give when they return to the past. It was quieter than that. A pull she couldn't name, a whisper she tried to ignore until ignoring it became impossible. The gate creaked as she pushed it open. The sound made her chest tighten. Not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. It sounded the same as it did when she was a girl sneaking out at dusk, chasing after fireflies, pretending she wasn't afraid of the dark. Now, the only thing chasing her was silence. Inside, the air was heavy with stillness. A layer of dust rested on everything, like time had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. The curtains swayed with the faintest breeze, brushing against the window pane like an old friend's hand. Somewhere, deep in the walls, the wood shifted and sighed, as if the house was clearing its throat, trying to say something it had been holding in for years. She ran her fingers along the edge of the kitchen table, the same one her mother used to polish every Sunday afternoon. It still had that small burn mark near the corner, from the time she placed a hot pot there, and her mother scolded her gently, laughing through her words. It was strange how certain things never left, even when everyone else did. In the hallway, a framed photograph hung crooked. Her younger self smiled from inside it, bright-eyed, certain, unaware of how easily love could become distance. She reached out to fix it, but her hand froze halfway. Something about touching it felt wrong, like interrupting a memory mid-breath. The fridge still hummed. She didn't know why that sound mattered so much, but it did. It meant the house was still alive, holding on, just enough to remember. She opened the door to her old room. The smell hit her first. Faint soap, worn fabric, a hint of her mother's perfume, long faded but never gone. The curtains were drawn halfway, spilling soft light across the bedspread she once hated for being too floral. It looked the same. Everything did. Everything except her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees, and listened. There was no music, no footsteps, no voices calling her name. Yet the silence was full. It was full of what used to be here. Laughter, arguments, the sound of her father's shoes by the door, the clatter of her mother's bracelets as she cooked. All those ordinary sounds that made a house feel alive. Now, the walls were holding all of it, keeping it safe, like a secret. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, it was as if time folded back on itself. She could almost see her mother's reflection in the mirror, brushing her hair. Her father humming off-key in the garden, the ghost of a life still breathing, just beneath the surface of her memory. I told myself I left to find peace, she whispered to no one. But peace doesn't live in the absence of love. It lives in the forgiveness of it. The light outside shifted, the kind that comes before evening. It cast long shadows across the floor, stretching toward her feet like old memories trying to reach her. She sat there until the quiet became too heavy, until the walls felt too close. Then she stood, took one slow breath, and stepped back into the hall. The floor creaked again, the same sound, the same note. And for a fleeting second, it felt like the house was greeting her. Not warmly, not coldly, just knowingly. She paused by the front door before stepping out. The garden was overgrown, but wildflowers had found their way through the cracks of the walkway. The same stubborn kind her mother used to pull out every spring, only for them to bloom again. Some things refused to leave, no matter how forgotten they were. As the wind moved through the leaves, she thought she heard something soft. Not words exactly, but a presence. A feeling that lingered somewhere between grief and grace. Maybe it was the house remembering. Maybe it was her finally listening. When she turned back to lock the door, she hesitated. For years, she had blamed this place for holding her back, for keeping her small. But standing there now, she realized, it wasn't the house that trapped her. It was the part of herself she left behind inside it. The key turned easily, like it always had. And yet somehow she knew she wasn't done here. Not yet. There was a time when love didn't feel heavy. It lived in the small things, the smell of rice steaming in the kitchen, her mother's voice humming along to the old radio, her father's laugh echoing faintly from the garden. She used to think that was what happiness looked like. Warmth stitched between chores, comfort hidden in routine. She was the eldest daughter, the one who woke up first, slept last, and learned early that being loved sometimes meant being useful. While her siblings still rubbed the sleep from their eyes, she was already folding laundry, peeling vegetables, sweeping the floor before school. Her mother would say, "You're my right hand," and smile proudly. And for years, that smile was enough to make the tiredness disappear. But love, when built on obligation, starts to lose its shape. She didn't notice it at first. The slow creep of expectation. The way thank you slowly turned into you should. By the time she was old enough to understand it, the line between love and duty had blurred beyond repair. The kitchen was always alive back then. The smell of garlic and onion, the sound of oil sizzling, her mother's bracelets clinking against the pan. There was laughter, hers, her father's, her siblings, but underneath it all, she felt the quiet pulse of something unsaid. Responsibility, pressure, the unspoken rule that she must keep the family together. Her father used to call her steady. "You don't crumble," he'd say. "You hold everyone up." She'd smile back, proud at first. Until one day she realized no one was holding her. She learned to swallow her exhaustion in small sips. When her mother grew sick for a short while, she took over everything, the cooking, the cleaning, the bills. Neighbors praised her, called her strong. Her mother cried softly, saying, "You're such a good daughter." But she couldn't remember the last time someone asked how she was doing. The truth was, she didn't know. Some nights she'd stand by the window after everyone had gone to bed, watching the lights in the neighboring houses. She imagined lives that didn't revolve around obligation, people laughing without purpose, people resting without guilt. The thought made her ache, but also feel something dangerous. Desire. For freedom. For a life that was her own. There were moments of real warmth, too. Quiet, fleeting, and honest. The way her mother would brush her hair on Sunday mornings. The way her father would hum in the garden and call her to help with the weeds. Sometimes she'd sit with them, hands smelling of soil, and feel almost content. But even in those moments, she knew. She was performing the role of a good daughter, not living as herself. Then came the years when everyone grew older. Her siblings left for school. Her friends began their own lives, and she stayed. The reliable one. The anchor that held everything steady while others drifted forward. When she finally decided to leave, to marry, to move away, to start something new, her parents smiled, but their eyes said something else. Her mother's hug lingered longer than usual. Her father's silence at dinner felt like a wound covered in politeness. No one said it aloud, but she knew. Leaving wasn't supposed to be her story. In the city, the air felt different. Faster, colder, full of noise and strangers. At first, it was exhilarating. No one called her name every 5 minutes. No one needed her for anything. For the first time in her life, she could wake up late, eat alone, make mistakes without anyone noticing. Freedom felt like sunlight after too many years of shade. But like all new light, it also exposed what she had buried deep. She missed the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's cough, the familiar weight of being depended on. She told herself it was nostalgia, that she was simply adjusting to change. But deep down, she knew it was guilt, breathing through the cracks. The years that followed blurred together. Birthdays missed, letters half-written and never sent, visits postponed for next month. She learned to live without the sound of home. Convincing herself it was growth, her parents never complained. Their calls came less often, their words more measured. She didn't realize how much of her life they had quietly stepped out of, to give her the space she said she wanted. She began to confuse their silence for peace, Looking back now, she understood what she couldn't see then. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet endurance of parents who stop calling because they don't want to be a burden. It's the unspoken understanding that their child might never come home. She had mistaken love for weight, but maybe it wasn't love that made her feel trapped. Maybe it was her own fear of disappointing it. One evening, years later, she found an old photograph in a drawer. Her family sitting together, the table full of food, her mother's hand resting on her shoulder. She looked at her younger self and felt something break gently inside. That girl wasn't smiling because she was happy. She was smiling because everyone expected her to. She touched the photo's corner, tracing the faces she'd spent years avoiding. And for the first time, she whispered the truth she'd carried in silence. I wasn't tired of them. I was tired of never being me. It was strange, realizing how easily love can disguise itself as duty. How it can wear the face of care while quietly asking you to disappear. But maybe that's what families do without meaning to. They build you from their needs until you forget your own shape. Still, she didn't hate them for it. How could she? They were only doing what they knew, loving her the way they had been taught to love, by holding on too tightly. And now, all these years later, standing in the same house, she could finally see it for what it was. Not cruelty, not selfishness. Just love, too heavy to carry in the wrong hands. When she stepped back into the kitchen that evening, she ran her fingers along the countertop, feeling the grooves in the wood her mother once scrubbed smooth. For the first time, she didn't feel bitterness. Just a quiet ache, the kind that doesn't demand forgiveness, only understanding. Maybe love was never meant to be light. Maybe it was meant to test how long we could hold on, before learning that letting go was also a kind of care. There are silences that feel like rest, and then there are silences that feel like distance, the kind that stretches slowly, one unanswered call at a time. At first, she didn't mean for it to happen. She would let the phone ring thinking, I'll call them back after dinner. Then it became after work, then tomorrow, and before long, tomorrow turned into years. The city had its own rhythm. Fast, unyielding, indifferent. Days began to blend together, filled with deadlines and dinners, laughter that didn't reach her eyes. In the background of it all, the phone would ring, a reminder that somewhere, love still waited. Quietly, patiently, with fading hope. The last time she visited home, the air had felt different. Her mother had grown quieter, her father more forgetful. She'd noticed how small they both looked sitting at the dinner table, like time had taken a little more than it should have. They talked about ordinary things, weather, neighbors, the price of vegetables, but underneath every word was something fragile. An ache they didn't name, an understanding that she was already halfway gone. When she left that weekend, her mother stood by the gate, waving as she always did. Her father said, "Drive safe," his voice steady but distant. And she remembered thinking, they'll be fine. That was how she justified the growing space, by convincing herself they didn't need her anymore. In truth, it wasn't them she was running from. It was the version of herself she became when she was with them. The dutiful daughter, the peacemaker, the one who had no room for mistakes. In the city, she could breathe differently. No one expected her to be good all the time. She could forget who she used to be. But forgetting, she would learn, always asks for something in return. She kept their number saved but never dialed it. She told herself she was busy, that they wouldn't understand her life now. That calls were just formalities, and love didn't need constant reminders. Yet, every time she heard someone on the train talking to their mother, every time she passed a cafe where a father and daughter shared lunch, something inside her shifted, a small, sharp pull beneath the ribs. The kind that reminded her of what she was trying so hard not to feel. She drowned it out with noise, with work, with people, with anything that didn't sound like memory. There was one evening when she came home to her apartment after a long day. The room was dim, the air heavy. On the table, the answering machine blinked red. 2 missed calls. She played them out of habit. Her father's voice, soft and wavering, came through. "Just checking in. Hope you're eating well." Then a pause. and her mother's faint voice in the background. "Tell her we love her." The message ended there. For a moment, she stood still, the hum of the fridge the only sound in the room. She could have called back. She wanted to, but instead she pressed delete. It was easier to erase the reminder than to confront what it meant. Silence has a strange way of reshaping love. It starts as space, necessary, harmless, but it grows, quietly, until it becomes a wall. And once the wall is high enough, even memory starts to echo. She began to forget the sound of her mother's laughter, her father's cough, the smell of home-cooked rice. She replaced them with city noises, the clatter of dishes, the sound of rain on glass, the dull hum of the street below. Noise pretending to be life. Sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night, unsure of what stirred her. The city lights flickered through the curtains, and she'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something press against her chest, a loneliness that had no shape, a longing she didn't have words for. She'd reach for her phone, thumb hovering over her parents' number, and then pull her hand back. It had been too long, too many missed calls, too many excuses. What would she even say now? So she'd turn the phone face down and close her eyes, convincing herself that sleep was easier than honesty. The weeks turned to months. Birthdays came and went. She sent gifts through the mail. Pretty things, thoughtful enough to ease her guilt, but distant enough to keep her safe. Her parents never complained. They sent thank you notes, always ending with, "We miss you, but we're glad you're happy." The words stung more than they should have, because they weren't lies. They were kindness disguised as letting go. And maybe that was what hurt the most. There was a night, late, quiet, and cold, when she dreamt of home. She saw her mother in the kitchen, turning toward her with that familiar smile. But when she tried to speak, no sound came out. Her father sat by the window, looking out, as though waiting for someone who had promised to return. When she woke, her pillow was damp. She told herself it was just a dream, but deep down she knew. It was a memory, asking to be remembered. Years later, she found herself sitting at a cafe, watching an older couple share a meal. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her spoon, and the man reached over, steadying it without saying a word. The gesture was simple, but in that small act, she saw everything she had left behind: care, quietness, the language of love spoken without sound. She looked away, blinking back something she didn't want to admit. Because it was then she realized she hadn't been escaping her family. She had been escaping the version of love that required patience, presence, and imperfection. The kind of love that calls even when it knows no one will answer. She went home that evening and sat by the window. The city buzzed outside, people, cars, laughter, but none of it touched her. In that moment, she finally understood that freedom had a cost. It wasn't loneliness she was feeling. It was consequence. She reached for her phone again, the same number still saved under home. But before she could press the call button, the screen went dark, her battery dead. It felt like the universe whispering what she already knew. Some connections fade long before they break. Silence had become her way of coping. But it had also become her confession. Every missed call, every deleted message, every unspoken word. They were all tiny admissions of fear. Fear of facing the people who loved her enough to wait. Fear of hearing their voices and realizing how much time she had lost. And yet, the cruelest thing about silence is that it pretends to protect you, right until the day it doesn't. That night, as she lay in bed, the city felt quieter than usual. She could almost hear the echo of an old ringtone, faint, distant, like something carried by memory. She closed her eyes and whispered to no one, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, unheard, unanswered, but somehow, they felt like a beginning. Because sometimes, healing doesn't start with calling back. It starts with remembering the sound of the ring. It began quietly, as most endings do. No arguments, no slammed doors, just a space where something used to be. For months, her parents had kept sending letters. Each envelope was written in her father's steady hand, a little shaky now, but still careful. as if the act of writing was his way of holding her close. Inside were short updates. What the neighbors were up to, the weather back home, her mother's new hobby of growing marigolds in old tin cans. Every letter ended the same way. "Take care of yourself. We're proud of you," she always meant to reply. She'd even buy pretty stationery, promising herself she'd write that weekend. But weekends became months, and the pile of unopened envelopes on her shelf grew taller, like a quiet reminder of everything she was avoiding. Then one day, the letters stopped coming. At first, she didn't notice. The days passed in their usual blur. Morning coffee, crowded trains, tired evenings. Until one Saturday, she caught herself looking at the empty spot on the kitchen counter where her mail usually waited. No new envelope, no familiar handwriting, just silence. She brushed it off. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they'd call instead. But deep down, something small and cold began to settle inside her, a knowing she didn't want to name. Weeks went by. She checked her phone every night before bed. No missed calls, no messages. Even the occasional forwarded text from her mother. A quote, a recipe, a blessing, stopped appearing. The quiet stretched longer, heavier, until one evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She sat at her desk, pulled out one of the unopened envelopes from months ago, and carefully slid it open. The paper inside smelled faintly of home, that mix of incense, old wood, and something sweet she couldn't quite place. Her father's handwriting greeted her again. "Your mother isn't feeling well these days, but she keeps asking when you'll visit." Then a line below, written in her mother's softer script, "Don't worry about us. Just be happy." She pressed the paper to her chest and cried for the first time in years. Not the loud kind, but the kind that feels like a quiet surrender. The next morning, she decided to call. She dialed their number, heart pounding, each ring echoing like a second chance. But no one picked up. She tried again. And again, still nothing. By the fifth attempt, the line went dead. A mechanical voice replaced her mother's warm greeting. "The number you are trying to reach is not in service." Her stomach dropped. She checked, redialed, even called the operator. But it was true. The line had been disconnected. And that's when it hit her. It wasn't just a phone line that had gone silent. Something deeper had ended. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the city lights blurring behind her tears. For years, she had kept herself so busy running forward that she never noticed how far behind she'd left the people who had loved her most. She told herself it was for the best, that everyone needed space to grow. But now, that space felt like an open wound. She thought of her mother's marigolds, of her father's careful handwriting, of all the times she should have called but didn't, and she wondered if they had stopped waiting for her, not out of anger, but out of quiet acceptance. The next morning, she took the train back home. The same route she used to take years ago, except now, everything looked smaller. The fields, the trees, even the sky seemed to carry a faded hue. When she arrived at the familiar street, the air smelled the same, earth and rain and faint jasmine. But something was missing. The gate was closed, the windows shuttered. The house looked still. A neighbor saw her and came over, hesitating before speaking. "Oh, you're their daughter." Her voice trembled slightly. "Your father passed away 2 months ago. Heart failure." She paused. "Your mother moved to your aunt's place. She doesn't come out much these days." The words hit like a slow wave. No sound, no tears, just a hollow ache spreading through her chest. Inside the house, everything was just as they had left it. Her father's slippers by the door, the teacups still stacked neatly on the counter. Her mother's favorite shawl folded on the couch, but the air, it was heavy. As if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for her to return. On the dining table lay a small pile of letters tied together with a red string. Her name written on every one of them. She untied the bundle and began to read. Each letter was a mirror of time. Her father writing about the tomatoes that finally grew red this season. Her mother sharing that she'd been sleeping less, but "Don't worry, I'm fine." And then, one letter that stopped her breath. It was dated 3 weeks before her father's passing. Inside, in shaky writing, he had written, "If we don't hear from you soon, just know that we love you anyway." Just that. No guilt, no anger, only love. Pure and undeserved, waiting quietly even at the edge of goodbye. She stayed in that house for hours, reading every word, tracing the ink with her fingers as if touch could bring time back. When the sun set, she stepped outside and saw the marigolds her mother had planted. They were blooming, golden, stubborn, alive. For the first time, she realized they weren't just flowers. They were messages that kept growing even after silence took over. She knelt down and whispered, "I'm home." The wind moved gently through the leaves, almost like an answer. That night, she sat in her father's old chair and finally wrote a letter of her own. It began with the simplest of words. "I'm sorry I took so long." She didn't know where to send it. Maybe she never would, but writing it felt like laying down a part of the weight she had been carrying for years. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't something you receive. It's something you finally allow yourself to feel. By morning, she packed her things and went to visit her mother at her aunt's house. Her mother opened the door slowly, smaller, frailer, but with the same eyes. For a moment, they just stood there, both unsure how to bridge the silence between them. Then her mother reached out, touched her face, and said softly, "You came." And that was all it took. Years of distance melted in a single tearful embrace. They sat together all afternoon, saying little. The air smelled of tea and marigolds. Her mother talked about small things, recipes, neighbors, her father's old radio. No blame, no questions, just gentle remembering, and in that simplicity, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but lets it rest. That night, as she helped her mother to bed, she noticed a small wooden box on the bedside table. Inside was the last letter her father ever wrote. It wasn't addressed to her, but to the one who will come home one day. The letter read, "If you're reading this, it means you found your way back. That's all that matters." She held the paper close, tears falling softly onto the ink, and for the first time, she understood what her father had always tried to teach her. That love doesn't disappear when you leave. It just waits quietly for you to return. That night she stood by the window, looking out at the moonlight spilling over the garden. The marigolds glowed golden under the night sky, bright, stubborn, alive. She whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for still being here." And though no one answered, she felt something stir in the air. Not quite forgiveness, not quite goodbye, but something gentler. Something like peace. The days that followed moved slowly, like an old film reel playing frame by frame, quiet, steady, and filled with the kind of pauses that say more than words ever could. For the first time in years, she wasn't rushing anywhere. She woke up to the sound of sparrows on the windowsill, made tea the way her mother used to. 2 spoons of sugar, a dash of cardamom, and sat on the porch watching sunlight crawl across the garden. It felt strange, this stillness. Like returning to a version of herself she'd forgotten existed. Her mother was doing better, though she rarely spoke about the past. Some days she hummed while cooking, the melody soft and wavering, almost fragile. Other days she sat by the window, gazing out toward the marigolds, lost in thought. And though they didn't talk much, the silence between them had changed. It no longer carried accusation and only understanding, like 2 people who finally realized that love doesn't always need to be spoken aloud to be felt. One morning, while cleaning the old cabinet in her father's study, she found a dusty journal tucked behind a stack of faded receipts. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, and inside, her father's handwriting, steady as ever. Each entry was simple, notes about the garden, the weather, the neighbors. But then, halfway through, a line caught her breath. "She hasn't called in a while. Her mother worries. I tell her love is patient, and even when it hurts." She kept reading. "We did our best to raise her to be strong. Maybe that strength is why she needs to be far away, Maybe we should be proud of that. Her vision blurred. She closed the book, held it against her chest, and whispered, "You were proud of me." The room was silent, but in that stillness she felt it. His presence not haunting but gentle. A quiet forgiveness that had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. That afternoon she walked through the garden, touching the marigolds one by one. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of earth after rain. She thought about everything she had left behind, birthdays missed, letters unread, phone calls unanswered, and realized that she had spent so much time running from her past that she never learned how to belong anywhere else. "I thought freedom meant leaving," she said softly to herself. "But maybe freedom means learning how to stay." The words surprised her. Not rehearsed, not planned, just truth, surfacing at last. That evening, she sat with her mother on the veranda as the sun dipped low behind the trees. Her mother's hand rested lightly on hers, fragile but warm. They watched the sky change colors, from gold to rose to deep violet. Her mother broke the silence. "You look like him when you sit like that," she said, smiling faintly. She laughed, a small, tearful sound. "I used to think that was an insult." Her mother chuckled softly. "No, dear. It was always a blessing." And for the first time, she allowed herself to smile, really smile, at the memory of her father. Later that night, she opened a box of old photographs. There they were, the family she once thought she had outgrown. Her father holding her as a baby, her mother laughing mid-motion, her younger siblings chasing each other through the backyard, everyone so alive, so unaware of how fragile those moments were. She realized then that love isn't something you abandon. It's something you carry, even when you don't want to. Every decision, every silence, every distance, all of it shaped who she had become. But it didn't have to define who she'd be from now on. Over the next few weeks, she began to help her mother rebuild the rhythm of their days. They cleaned the house together, one room at a time, washing curtains, polishing furniture, airing out old sheets. Every object held a memory, and with each one they talked a little more. When they found her father's favorite mug, chipped but still intact, her mother smiled. "He refused to throw it away," she said. "Said it had character." She laughed softly. He said that about people too. And just like that, the heaviness lifted a little. Not gone, just lighter. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, her mother suddenly asked, "Why did you stop coming home?" The question was gentle, not accusing, just curious. But it hit deep. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her plate. "I thought I was suffocating here," she admitted. "I thought if I stayed I'd lose myself." Her mother nodded slowly. "And did you find yourself?" A pause. "Not really," she said, voice trembling. "I just found more ways to feel lost." Her mother smiled sadly. "We all get lost, love. Some of us just take longer to come home." The words lingered in the air, soft, forgiving, final. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the open window, the sound of crickets rising like a song of remembrance. She thought about all the years she had spent avoiding pain, only to realize that in doing so, she had been avoiding love too. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm sorry." Not to anyone in particular, but to everything. To her younger self who tried so hard to be perfect. To her parents who loved her in their flawed, quiet way. To time itself, for moving faster than she could understand. And in that small moment of truth, she felt something shift. A loosening of the ache that had lived in her for so long. The next morning, she woke up early and decided to visit her father's grave. She brought marigolds, bright and gold and stubbornly alive. The cemetery was still, the air heavy with dew. She knelt by the gravestone, brushed away the leaves and whispered, "I thought I had to leave to be whole. But you were my wholeness all along." A single tear fell, soaking into the earth. She didn't wipe it away. Some things deserve to stay where they fall. As she stood to leave, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and smoke. the same scent that always lingered in their home after dinner. She smiled. It felt like he was there, not as a memory but as presence, still watching, still proud. When she returned home, her mother was waiting by the porch. She held up a cup of tea, steam curling softly in the morning light. "Welcome back," her mother said, and for the first time she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like someone who had finally come home, not to a place, but to herself. That night she wrote in her journal, "Some things don't break when you leave. They wait. Quietly, patiently, until you find your way back to them." She closed the book, blew out the candle, and sat for a long time in the dark, not in loneliness, but in peace. Because sometimes the hardest part of love isn't holding on, it's learning how to return. The house had grown quieter over the weeks. Not empty, just still, like it too was holding its breath, waiting for something sacred to unfold. Her mother's health had begun to fade gently, like the slow dimming of a candle. There were no grand gestures, no final speeches. Just small things, the way her hands trembled when folding laundry, the way she paused between words, as if savoring every syllable life still gave her. The daughter began waking up earlier, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She'd make tea before dawn, pour 2 cups, and wait by the window for her mother to join her. Most mornings they didn't speak. They simply watched the first light touch the marigolds, the same flowers her mother once planted when life still felt endless. And in that quiet, something began to heal. Silence had always frightened her before. It used to mean distance, disapproval, the kind of space that grew between people who once loved each other too loudly. But now silence felt different. It was tender, gentle, full of presence, a language all its own, one that didn't need words to say, "I forgive you." Her mother would sometimes reach for her hand across the table, no reason, no words, just touch. It was enough. Enough to make her realize that forgiveness wasn't a single moment or a phrase. It was the quiet decision to stay, even after everything had broken. As days passed, her mother grew smaller in frame, but larger in peace. She'd hum the same tune each afternoon, a song the daughter didn't remember learning but somehow knew by heart. Sometimes she'd laugh softly at old memories, her eyes distant but kind. One evening, as they sat by the window, her mother whispered, "Do you hear that?" She listened, faintly. Somewhere beyond the rustle of leaves, a bird was singing. "It sounds like he's saying goodbye," her mother said. The daughter smiled, a lump in her throat. "Or maybe he's saying thank you," her mother nodded. That too. They didn't talk after that. They didn't need to. The moment had already said everything. The next morning, the daughter found her mother asleep in the chair by the window. Her breathing was slow, steady, peaceful. The cup of tea beside her was still warm. She sat beside her, holding her hand, tracing the wrinkles that told the story of a life well lived, and a love that never gave up, even when distance tried to rewrite it. When her mother stirred, she smiled faintly and whispered, "You stayed." Her voice was weak, but her eyes were bright, soft, forgiving. "I should have never left," the daughter replied, her voice breaking. Her mother shook her head, slow and tender. "No, you came back. That's what matters." Tears slipped quietly down her face, but they didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt like cleansing, like rain on dry earth. When the end came, it was gentle. Her mother drifted in her sleep, exhaling softly as if releasing every burden she'd carried. No struggle, no sound. Just a quiet departure, like the closing of a book that had been read too many times and loved every time more deeply. The daughter sat there long after. The room was filled with morning light, warm and golden, wrapping her in something that felt like a final embrace. She didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, she breathed. Long, steady breaths, each one reminding her she was still here, still alive, still part of the love that had shaped her. That night, she walked into the garden. The sky was vast, scattered with stars. The marigolds glowed faintly under the moonlight. She knelt down, touched the soil, and whispered, Thank you. For love. For forgiveness. For the years that broke her, and the ones that put her back together. In the days that followed, she began to notice small things. Tiny gifts from the world that felt almost like whispers from her mother. The scent of jasmine carried through the wind. The faint hum of the refrigerator that never seemed to stop. The way sunlight fell on the same spot her mother's chair used to sit. Life continued, quietly, but differently now. Slower, softer. And for once, she didn't rush it. Weeks later, she stood by her father's grave again, beside the one now freshly marked with her mother's name. The two stones stood side by side, simple, unadorned, perfectly together. She placed her hands on both and whispered, "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." And as the wind brushed against her face, she felt something shift. Not just forgiveness, but acceptance. A peace so complete it didn't feel like closure. It felt like beginning again. That evening she sat alone in the house, the kind of quiet that once haunted her now wrapping her gently. She picked up her mother's old apron, folded it neatly, and placed it over the chair. Then she turned off the lights and stood by the window. The moonlight washed the room in silver, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw her mother standing there, smiling, silent, radiant. But when she blinked, there was only her reflection, and it was enough. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Love never leaves. It just changes rooms." Then she smiled. Not because she was healed, but because she had learned that healing isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about carrying it gently enough to make space for peace beside it. And in that moment, she finally heard it. What forgiveness truly sounds like in silence. It wasn't absence. It wasn't sorrow. It was love, breathing quietly in the spaces between everything that had ever gone wrong. Spring arrived slowly that year. The kind of spring that didn't rush in with color, but unfolded with patience. Soft greens first, then hesitant blossoms that seemed to test the air before fully blooming. The house had grown older too, the paint fading, the wood groaning in the afternoon heat. But the garden was alive again. She had started tending it a week after her mother's funeral. At first it felt wrong, as if digging in that soil was disturbing something sacred. But the moment her hands sank into the earth, something inside her began to shift. She found old seeds her mother had kept in a tin box labeled "Next Season." It was rusted, worn, but still holding life inside. And for the first time in years, she smiled. Every morning she worked in silence. The birds were her company, the breeze her song. There was no need for words. Each shovel of dirt, each tiny seed pressed into the soil, felt like a conversation, not with the earth, but with memory itself. The marigolds came first, stubborn and bright. Then the jasmine, curling along the fence as if searching for the scent of her mother's shawl. She watered them carefully, whispering to each plant like they were old friends returning from a long journey. Sometimes she would pause and look at the horizon, remembering the day she left home all those years ago, chasing something that never quite filled the hollow inside her. She thought about the faces she'd met, the places she'd called home, and the nights she'd wished she could go back, and now, here she was, in the same garden where it all began, realizing that the peace she had searched for across cities and years was buried in this soil all along. She laughed softly, a sound that startled even her. It wasn't the laughter of someone without sorrow. It was the laughter of someone who had finally learned to live beside it. One morning, a little girl from the neighborhood came by. She stood by the fence, eyes wide. "Did you plant all this?" she asked. The woman nodded, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Most of it. My mother started it a long time ago." The girl smiled, pointing at a cluster of marigolds. "They look like little suns," she chuckled. That's what she used to call them too. The girl watched her for a moment before asking, "Can I help?" It was such a simple question, but it carried something sacred. She nodded, handing the girl a small trowel. "Of course." As the child knelt beside her, digging carefully into the earth, the woman felt something stir deep within her chest. Not grief, not regret, but warmth. Like the world had quietly started over again, and she was part of it. The garden began to change after that. Children came and went, helping her plant, laughing among the rows of flowers. Neighbors brought seeds, stories, and sometimes just silence, and she realized healing doesn't always look like peace. Sometimes it looks like company. At night, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the wind move through the garden. And in the rustle of leaves, she could almost hear her mother's voice, soft, amused, full of love. See? You finally stayed long enough to see it bloom. As the years went by, the house became known as the garden house. People would stop to take photos, to breathe, to rest. And she, now older, with hair streaked in silver, would smile and wave, a quiet keeper of what once was, and what still could be. On her mother's birthday each year, she would place a single marigold on the windowsill, not out of grief, but gratitude. She knew now that abandonment had a price, but so did return. And sometimes, the beauty of coming back was worth every mile of the leaving. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood in the garden with her hands clasped together. The flowers glowed under the golden light, and she whispered softly, "Nothing we love ever truly leaves. It just learns new ways to be here." She felt the wind brush her cheek, warm, familiar, like a touch she'd known all her life. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone. The garden swayed gently, alive with memory and renewal. It didn't erase what had been lost. It simply proved that love, once rooted, never stops growing. And so, the story ends not with goodbye, but with a quiet truth. That forgiveness, once planted, blooms for a lifetime. That home isn't a place we return to. It's a peace we learn to keep inside. And that even after the hardest winters, there's always a garden waiting to grow again. Maybe the price of abandoning family isn't losing them, but losing the part of yourself that only they could have helped you find again.